The unhurried resurfacing of a country lane. The morning came to the country lane the way it always did, without any announcement at all, the darkness thinning by degrees until you could not say exactly when it had become light, only that the hedgerows had grown shapes again and the soft grey of the fields had warmed into something nearer to green. There was no wind to speak of, just the gentlest stirring of air that moved across the tops of the grasses and asked nothing of them. The lane itself lay where it had always lain, curving without urgency between two long rows of hedge, going from one quiet place to another quiet place, carrying almost nobody, and content, you felt, to carry almost nobody for as long as the world should care to keep it. It was along this lane, at the hour when the dew still lay heavy on every blade and every leaf, that the small road crew arrived. They came in a single old truck that rolled to a stop with a long sigh of its brakes, a sound so soft and so drawn out that it seemed less a stopping than a settling, the way a large and tired animal settles into the straw at the end of a long day. The engine ticked and cooled. For a little while nobody got out. The men inside sat with their hands around warm cups, looking through the windscreen at the road they had come to mend, and there was no hurry in them at all, for the work would take a week, and a week was a generous and comfortable amount of time, and there was no part of it that needed doing before any other part was ready to be done. When at last the doors opened, they opened slowly. The first man stepped down onto the verge and stood there a moment with his cup still in his hand, breathing the cool air and looking at the sky, which was the pale color of the inside of a shell, with one long thin cloud drawn across it like a single brushstroke that someone had thought better of finishing. He was an older man, broad and unhurried, with a face that had spent many years out of doors and had taken on the calm of weather that has nothing in particular to do. He drank the last of his tea, tipped the very last drop onto the grass where a beetle was making its slow way through the wet stems, and then he set the cup back inside the cab and reached for the cones. The cones were stacked in a tall and tidy column, one nested neatly inside the next, and they came apart with a soft sucking pop, a small plastic sound that was somehow very pleasant, as though each cone were politely taking its leave of the one above it. The man carried an armful of them down the lane, and he set them out one by one along the center of the road, pacing the distance between them with his own slow steps, 3 steps and a cone, 3 steps and a cone, so that they came to stand in a long sleepy row that wandered down the lane and around the gentle bend and out of sight. Each cone sat squarely on its square base. Each one was the soft faded orange of a thing that has been left in the sun for many summers, and around the middle of each ran a band of white that had gone the color of old cream. They stood there in the early light like a procession of small patient figures who had all been told to wait, and who did not mind waiting in the least, and who would wait there, perfectly content, until they were asked to do otherwise. A second man followed behind the first, and his task was to make sure that the cones stood straight, for 1 or 2 of them had been set down a little crooked, leaning as though they had grown sleepy on their feet, and he went along the row and nudged each one upright with the toe of his boot, a small kindness performed without any thought at all. Where the verge dipped he packed a little earth beneath a base to keep it level. Where a tall stem of cow parsley leaned across a cone he bent it gently aside. He took his time. There was no reason not to. The mist still lay in the low places of the fields, pooled in the dips the way milk pools in a saucer, and a blackbird somewhere in the hedge was turning over its first slow notes of the morning, trying them out, in no hurry to commit to a song. When the cones were all in place, the whole length of the lane had been claimed for the work, and yet nothing about it felt closed off or forbidden. It felt, rather, like a room that had been quietly tidied and made ready, a place set gently apart so that something careful could be done there. The men stood at one end and looked down the row of cones, and they nodded to one another, not because anything needed saying but because it was a satisfying thing to see, a job begun, a line drawn neat and true along the center of a sleepy country road. Now they turned their attention to the surface itself, And here the morning slowed even further, for inspecting a road is a thing that cannot be hurried, and these were men who would not have hurried it even if they could. The older man walked the lane with his hands clasped behind his back, bent slightly forward, his eyes moving across the worn grey skin of the road the way a doctor's eyes move across a patient who has come in only for the comfort of being looked at. He read the road. He noted where the years had gone into it. Here was a crack, a fine one, no wider than a thread, running for a little way and then thinking better of it and stopping, the kind of crack that comes simply from a road growing old in the ordinary way, from the heat of many summers and the cold of many winters, from the slow breathing of the ground beneath as it swelled with rain and shrank again with dryness. He crouched beside it and traced it with one finger, feeling the soft grit at its edges, and he murmured something to himself, a low contented sound, the sound of a man finding exactly what he expected to find. A little further on there was a patch where the surface had faded paler than the rest, worn smooth and grey as old bone, where for years the wheels of the few vehicles that came this way had passed over the same line, polishing the stone without ever meaning to. There was a place where a tree root had pushed up beneath the road many years ago and made the gentlest of swells, a long low rise you would hardly notice unless you were looking, a slow green wave frozen in the grey. There were the marks of old repairs, dark rectangles of tar laid down by other men in other years, some of them so old now that they had faded to match the rest, the seams between them softened almost to nothing, so that the road was a quiet record of all the small attentions it had been given over a long and uneventful life. The men walked the length of it together, pausing where it pleased them to pause, and they spoke now and then in low unhurried voices about what they saw. They agreed about the crack near the bend. They agreed about the worn patch by the gate. They agreed, with great seriousness and not the slightest sense of alarm, that the whole of it had simply grown tired in the way that roads grow tired, and that what it wanted was not anything dramatic, only a new warm skin laid gently over the old one, a fresh surface to carry it through the next long stretch of quiet years. They made their notes. One of them carried a small flat board with a sheet of paper clipped to it, and he wrote in pencil in a slow and careful hand, the pencil whispering against the paper, and now and then he licked the tip of the pencil and looked up at the hedgerow and thought, and then wrote a little more. There was nothing on that paper that needed deciding in a hurry. There was nothing anywhere that morning that needed deciding in a hurry. The sun by now had climbed a little higher, and the mist in the fields had begun to lift and thin, drawn up gently into the warming air, so that the green of the grass came out fuller and the dew began to dry from the tops of the hedges, though it lingered still in the cool shadows beneath. The blackbird had made up its mind at last, and it sang in long unfolding phrases that rose and fell and paused and began again, a song with no particular destination, a song for the sheer mild pleasure of singing on a morning when nothing was wrong. The men listened to it without listening, the way you listen to a clock, and they went on with their reading of the road. When at last the inspection was done, and every crack and patch and faded place had been noted and quietly agreed upon, the men turned to the matter of the tar, and this was a thing that asked above all for patience, for tar will not be hurried, and the warming of it was the slow heart of the whole morning. The drum stood on the back of the truck, a great black cylinder, round and patient as a sleeping creature, and beneath it the men lit a low and steady flame that whispered against the underside of the metal. The fire did not roar. It was not meant to roar. It murmured, a soft blue and orange murmur, licking gently upward, and the men adjusted it with small turns of a brass valve until it burned exactly as low and even as they wanted, and then they stepped back and left it to do its slow work. For a long while nothing seemed to happen at all. The drum stood there warming, and the fire murmured, and the men leaned against the side of the truck and waited, and the waiting was a comfortable thing, full of small sounds, the tick of the metal as it warmed, the soft hiss of the flame, the distant unbothered song of the blackbird. The older man took out a flask and poured more tea, and the steam from the tea rose up in a thin curling thread and mingled with the morning air, and he held the cup in both hands and watched the drum and said nothing, and it was enough. Slowly, by the smallest degrees, the tar within the drum began to soften and stir. You could not see it, of course, for the drum was closed, but you could begin to smell it, the deep dark warm smell of tar coming up to heat, a smell that is somehow both heavy and clean, a smell of roads and summer and patient work, and it drifted out from the drum and settled low over the lane and rolled gently across the verge and out over the top of the hedgerow. A slow tide of warm dark scent that mixed with the green smell of the cut grass and the cool damp smell of the earth. A thin grey steam began to rise from a vent at the top of the drum, the first soft breath of the warming tar, and it climbed straight up in the still air, a pale ribbon unwinding into the morning, until somewhere above the height of the hedge it caught a faint movement of the air and bent and softened and dissolved into nothing. The men watched the steam the way men have always watched smoke and steam and the slow movements of fire, with a quiet attention that asks for nothing in return. It drifted over the hedgerow and into the field beyond, where a few sheep stood in the lifting mist, lifting their heads to it and then losing interest and lowering them again to the grass, untroubled, as sheep are untroubled by nearly everything. A wood pigeon called from somewhere deep in the trees, that soft repeated five-note coo that is the very sound of a warm and idle day, over and over, going nowhere, asking nothing. The tar warmed on. The steam rose. The morning settled itself comfortably into its own slow rhythm, and there was no part of any of it that wished to be anywhere else. When the tar had come at last to the right warmth, the men tested it, dipping a long iron rod into the drum and lifting it out and watching the way the dark stuff ran from it in a slow glossy thread, and they judged by the look of that thread, by how it ran and how it shone and how slowly it fell, that the time had come. There was no signal, no call. One man simply set down his cup, and another straightened from where he leaned against the truck, and a third reached for a long-handled rake, and the next part of the work began as gently as the first part had ended, with no break between them, the way one slow hour gives way to the next. But before the tar was laid, there was the gravel, and the gravel was a pleasure all its own. It was kept in a great heap on the bed of a second truck, small pale stones each no larger than the tip of a finger, washed and sorted and dry, and when the men tipped a measure of it down a wide metal chute it came pouring out in a long rushing stream, a sound like rain on a tin roof but slower and heavier, a deep soft rattling pour that went on and then thinned and then stopped, leaving a low pale mound on the dark old surface of the lane. The stones settled against one another with small clicks and ticks, finding their places, and a few of the loose ones at the edge went rolling and bouncing a little way down the camber of the road before coming to rest, and then all was still again. Now came the raking, and this was the slowest and most patient part of all, and the men gave themselves to it without the least impatience. They drew the gravel out from the mound with their long rakes, pulling it across the road in even sweeps, this way and then that, leveling the high places and feeding the low ones, and they worked with their heads bent and their eyes on the stone, and the only sound was the long dry whisper of the rake teeth dragging through the gravel, again and again, a sound as soothing as the sea drawing back across a shingle beach. They did not rush. They could not rush, for the gravel must lie just so, even and true across the whole width of the road, neither thin in one place nor heaped in another, and the only way to make it lie just so was to draw the rake across it one stroke at a time, and to look, and to draw it again, and to look once more, until the eye was satisfied. The older man worked the center of the road and the younger men worked the edges, and now and then one of them would crouch and run a flat hand across the gravel to feel for any unevenness the eye had missed, and where he found a slight ridge he would tease it down with the side of the rake, the gentlest of corrections, and where he found a slight hollow he would coax a little more stone into it, and then he would smooth it over again and sit back on his heels and look at it for a while before moving on. The gravel under their hands was warm now where the sun fell on it, and cool in the long shadow of the hedge, and it had the dry, clean smell of stone, the smell of a riverbed in summer, the smell of a quarry floor, and when you walked across it your boots made a deep, satisfying crunch that pressed each small stone down a fraction into the bed beneath. The sun rose higher still, and the day grew mild and golden, one of those soft days in the middle of the warmer months when the air is neither hot nor cool but exactly the temperature of nothing at all, so that your skin forgets it has any boundary, and the world and the body seem to be made of the same gentle stuff. A few small white butterflies came wandering along the line of the hedge, rising and falling on the still air in their aimless way, pausing on a flower of cow parsley and then thinking better of it and drifting on, and the men paid them no mind, and the butterflies paid the men no mind, and both went about their unhurried business beneath the same wide, quiet sky. Somewhere far off, so far that it was less a sound than the memory of a sound, a dog barked twice and then fell silent, and the silence that followed was deeper and rounder for having been broken. When the gravel lay level at last, smoothed and even across the whole stretch they had begun, the men laid the warm tar over it, and the tar came from the drum down a wide spout in a slow black gleaming sheet, spreading and soaking down into the stone, binding it, darkening it, turning the pale dry gravel into a deep glistening surface that steamed faintly in the mild air. The smell of it rose up thick and warm again, the deep clean tarry smell, and it rolled once more over the hedge and out across the field, and the sheep lifted their heads and lost interest and lowered them again, and the wood pigeon went on with its 5 soft notes, on and on, asking nothing. The men spread the tar with their tools, drawing it even, and where it pooled too thick they coaxed it thinner, and where it ran too thin they fed it a little more, and they worked along the road in this way, slowly, slowly, an arm's length at a time, and behind them the lane grew dark and new and smooth, gleaming softly under the climbing sun. And then, when a good long stretch of it had been laid and spread and smoothed and judged to be right, the men brought up the roller, and the roller was the great slow heart of the whole week, the thing the rest of the work existed to serve, and the sound of its starting was a sound you could have fallen asleep to all on its own. It woke with a low cough and then settled into a deep and even hum, a sound that came up through the ground as much as through the air, a steady patient thrumming that you could feel in the soles of your feet and in your chest, and it sat there idling for a while, warming itself, trembling very gently, a great heavy creature of iron and steel gathering itself to move. The roller was an old one, painted a yellow that had faded almost to the color of straw, with a wide smooth drum at the front and another behind, and the man who drove it sat high up on a worn leather seat with his hands resting easy on the controls, and there was about him the particular calm of a man who has spent 10,000 hours doing one slow thing well. He eased the roller forward, and it went so slowly that for a moment you could not be sure it was moving at all, and then the whole great weight of it crept out onto the fresh-laid tar, and the smooth drum pressed down upon the warm dark surface and rolled across it, pressing the stone and the tar together into one firm even skin, and behind the roller the road came up glossy and flat and finished, a long dark mirror laid down across the green of the day. Forward the roller went, all the way to the far end of the new-laid stretch, humming its low steady hum, and then it stopped, and the driver looked back along the way he had come and was satisfied, and then he reversed, and the roller crept slowly backward over the same ground, pressing it once more, firming it once more, smoothing it once more, and then it stopped again and went forward again, and this was the rhythm of the whole long afternoon, forward and then back, forward and then back. The deep hum rising and falling as the engine took up the slope and eased down it, a sound as steady and as patient as breathing, a sound with no edges to it at all. There is something in the slow passing of a heavy roller back and forth that empties the mind of everything but itself, and the men who were not driving it stood at the verge and watched it for long stretches at a time without thinking of anything, their rakes resting idle in their hands, their faces soft and still. The drum gleamed where the sun caught it. The fresh tar steamed gently as it cooled beneath the weight. The smell of warm stone hung low over the lane. And the roller went forward, and the roller came back, and went forward, and came back, and the day wore on in the way that the best of days wear on, slowly, evenly, without anything to mark 1 hour from the next save the slow swing of the shadows around the feet of the hedgerow trees. It was a little after the middle of the afternoon, when the light had grown thick and golden and lay across the fields like syrup, that the tractor came. The men heard it before they saw it, a low chugging far off down the lane, the soft uneven beat of an old engine in no particular hurry, growing slowly nearer, and presently it came around the gentle bend, a faded green tractor with great mud-caked wheels and a single farmer sitting up on it in a flat cap, his elbow resting on the side. His pace exactly the pace of a man who has lived his whole life within a mile of this spot and has never once in that life needed to be anywhere quickly. He saw the cones and the steam and the slow yellow roller, and he eased back on his throttle and the tractor slowed still further and then came to a gentle stop a little way off, and the farmer settled back in his seat to wait. There was no impatience in him, and there was no fuss among the men. One of them, the older one, walked up the lane toward the tractor at his own unhurried pace, and he and the farmer exchanged a few words, the kind of words that men exchange who have all the time in the world, about the weather, which was fine, and about the hay, which was nearly ready, and about the lane, which was getting its new skin at last after all these years. The roller crept to the side and idled, its hum dropping to a deeper and gentler note, making room. And then the older man stepped back and lifted one arm in a slow easy wave, and the farmer touched the brim of his cap and let out the throttle, and the tractor chugged forward, picking its careful way along the firm edge of the lane past the cones and past the roller and past the men, who all raised their hands to it as it went, and the farmer raised his hand back, and the tractor rolled on around the next bend and away, its sound fading slowly into the green distance until it was gone, and the deep quiet of the afternoon flowed back in behind it like water closing over a stone. The men returned to their work, and the roller took up its full voice again and went forward and came back, and the laying and the raking and the spreading went on, a little at a time, and the new lane grew longer and darker and smoother behind them, reaching slowly down the curve of the hedgerow toward the place where it would meet the day's end. There was no haste in any of it. The week was long. The lane was patient. The light, slanting now from a little lower in the sky, fell warm and gold across the fresh dark surface and made it shine, and the steam rising from the cooling tar caught that light and glowed faintly as it drifted up and over the hedge and was gone. As the afternoon softened toward evening, the air began to cool, very slowly, the warmth of the day giving itself up by gentle degrees, and the shadows of the hedgerow trees stretched out long and thin across the new road, reaching nearly to the far verge. The color of the light changed, deepening from the bright pale gold of the afternoon to a richer, warmer, more amber color, the color of honey held up to a window, and it lay across the fields and the hedges and the slow yellow roller and turned everything it touched a little softer at the edges. The fresh-laid tar, which had steamed all afternoon, began now to steam less and less as it cooled, and the smell of it grew fainter, and the surface of it lost its first wet gleam and settled into a deep matte black, firm and even and finished, cooling quietly under the lengthening shadows. The men felt the change in the day the way you feel the turning of a tide, without needing to look, and they let their work slow to match it. The roller made its last few passes, forward and then back, forward and then back, the hum of it growing somehow gentler in the cooling air, and then the driver brought it to rest at the far end of the new stretch and let the engine idle for a long moment, the great machine trembling very softly beneath him, and then he eased it down to silence, and the hum sank away into nothing, and for the first time since the morning the lane was quiet of any engine at all. The silence that followed was a full and rounded silence, a silence with the day's warmth still in it, and into that silence came the first soft sounds of the evening, a blackbird again, low and unhurried, and the faint rustle of a small creature moving through the dry grass at the foot of the hedge, and somewhere far off the wood pigeon, still going, on, asking nothing. The men stood together at the verge in the amber light and looked at what they had done, at the long dark ribbon of new road lying smooth and finished along the curve of the lane, cooling gently, settling, and they felt the quiet satisfaction of a thing done slowly and done well, a satisfaction that has no edge of triumph to it, only a deep and comfortable rightness, the feeling of a day spent exactly as a day should be spent. They did not say much. There was not much to say. The road was good. The light was soft. The evening was coming on, mild and still, and there was nothing left to be done that could not wait for tomorrow. And so, in the last long stretch of the gentle day, they began to gather in the cones, and this was the closing of the work, the slow undoing of the morning's careful row, and it had about it the peaceful feeling of a thing being put away at the end. The older man walked the length of the lane, and as he came to each cone he bent and lifted it and turned it upside down and set it onto the one before, and they nested together one inside the next with that same soft sucking pop, that small and pleasant plastic sound, gathering into a tall and tidy column in his arms. 3 steps and a cone, 3 steps and a cone, the long row growing shorter behind him as the column grew taller, the lane opening up clear and finished anew in his wake. The faded orange cones, warm still from the day's sun, came in one by one out of the dusk, and the amber light caught their faded white bands and made them glow softly, and then they were stacked away and gone. He carried the column of cones back along the cooling road to the truck, walking slowly, his boots quiet now on the firm new surface, no longer crunching on loose gravel but pressing down on a road that no longer gave beneath him, a road made whole, and he set the cones up in the back of the truck where they had begun the morning, the tall neat column standing in its place, ready to sleep there through the night. The other men had gathered in the rakes and the irons and the long-handled tools, and they laid them away too, each in its place, the day's work folding itself quietly back into the truck, and the fire beneath the drum had long since been turned down and out, and the drum stood dark and cooling, its last thin thread of steam grown faint and then gone altogether. The light was going now, slipping down behind the far hedgerow, and the gold of the evening deepened toward rose and then toward a soft and dusty grey, and the first cool breath of the night came drifting along the lane, carrying the green smell of the fields and the faint last trace of warm tar, and the men felt it on their faces and were glad of it, the way you are glad of cool air at the end of a warm and easy day. The blackbird sang its last few notes and then was quiet. The wood pigeon, at last, fell silent. The sheep in the field had folded themselves down into the grass, pale shapes growing dim in the failing light, and the swallows that had wheeled all afternoon above the hedge came lower and slower and then went to their roosts, and one by one the small sounds of the day lay down and were still. The men climbed back into the old truck, and the doors closed one after another with soft and final clicks, and for a while they sat there in the dusk without starting the engine, looking out at the new road through the windscreen the way they had looked at the old road that morning, only now there was a whole day's work between. A whole long mild and patient day, and the lane lay before them smooth and dark and finished, cooling under the first stars. There was no hurry even now. There was nowhere they needed to be. They sat in the gathering dark and let the quiet settle over them, and the engine ticked, and the cones stood in their tidy column in the back, and the new road waited, asking nothing of anyone, ready to be driven on tomorrow, or the next day, or whenever someone should happen to come quietly along it. And when at last the truck did pull away, rolling slow and gentle down the lane on the very surface the men had spent the day laying down, its sound faded into the dusk the way the tractors had faded, growing smaller and softer and farther off, until it too was gone, and the lane was left alone in the falling night, alone and finished and still. The new tar cooled in the dark, settling, firming, growing quiet and whole. The hedgerows drew in close around it, deep shadows on either side. The cool air moved gently across the tops of the grasses and asked nothing of them. and the lane lay there in the stillness, between one quiet place and another quiet place, carrying nobody at all now, content to carry nobody at all through the long and gentle hours of the night, while above it the stars came out slowly, one by one, in no hurry, over a small mended road in the dark, and everything, everywhere, was at rest.